In 1981, riots broke out in Brixton. Margaret Thatcher's government faced mounting protests. The Tube was falling apart, but Top of the Pops was still on every Thursday. London was loud, divided, stylish and unforgettable. The streets smelled of petrol, fried onions and rebellion. Music exploded, walls were covered in graffiti, and wealth clashed with poverty at every traffic light. This wasn't the swinging 60s or polished present. It was something rougher, realer, a city between collapse and reinvention. Let's rewind the streets and see what London really looked like. Oxford Street in the 1980s was a battlefield of bags and bargains. Every weekend, the pavements overflowed with tourists, teenagers and tired parents. Red buses crawled by, while shop fronts flashed with neon signs and window mannequins posed in shoulder pads and acid-washed denim. You didn't just shop here, you got swallowed by the crowd. The stores were changing fast. Some still held on to old-world charm, like department stores with grand staircases and wood-polished perfume counters. But fast fashion was arriving. Chains took over, flashing sale signs in red and yellow as pop music blasted through open doors. It wasn't glamorous, it was chaos, consumerism, and a bit of magic all mixed together. Even if you didn't buy anything, walking down Oxford Street was an experience. It was London showing off, loud, fast and hungry for attention. And whether you loved or hated the crowds, you never forgot them. Camden in the 80s was raw, electric and unpredictable. The market wasn't yet polished for tourists. It was gritty, loud and unapologetically weird. You could find leather jackets, second-hand records, punk patches and political pins, all within the same row of stalls. The smell of incense mixed with fried food and spray paint. Musicians, rebels and outcasts made Camden their stage. Punks with spiked hair and ripped shirts stood beside Rastafarians selling handmade jewellery. Street performers played reggae, ska or synth pop, while alleyways pulsed with the sound of underground London. It was a place to get lost and to be found if you were looking for your tribe. Camden wasn't curated. It was chaotic. It didn't want to impress you. It wanted to shake you. And for those who came of age in that scene, it was more than a market, it was a movement. What was the first record you bought? Portobello Road in the 80s had the air of a fading photograph. It was charming but worn, a place where history clung to every awning and doorway. The Saturday market was its crown jewel, and by mid-morning it was packed with antique dealers, fruit vendors and old locals arguing over prices. The colours of the houses hadn't yet become Instagram famous. Back then, they were just homes, some crumbling, some immaculate. Tourists came, but so did collectors, artists and families who'd lived there for generations. You might stumble on a silver spoon from the 19th century or a scratched Beatles LP under a pile of second-hand coats. There was something slow and sincere about Portobello. It didn't roar like Camden or glow like Oxford Street, but it hummed warmly. And that hum sounded a lot like home. King's Cross in the 80s was not a postcard. It was gritty, tired and tense. Graffiti covered brick walls, the platforms smelled of oil and old coffee, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke. It felt more like a crossroads than a destination. By day, commuters rushed through its tunnels with blank faces, while announcements echoed through tinny speakers. By night, the area surrounding the station changed tone entirely. It was known for shadows, prostitution, rough pubs, and people who didn't want to be seen. But even in its decline, King's Cross had a strange kind of poetry. It was the kind of place where you could disappear or start over, a place where people left, returned or waited, never just stood still. And as the decade went on, whispers of change began, but the scars of the 80s still ran deep. Soho in the 80s didn't sleep. It burned. Neon signs blinked above smoky doorways, and music spilled into the streets from behind thick velvet curtains. This was the epicenter of nightlife, rebellion, and blurred lines. You could go for jazz, punk, or something much darker, and find it all within a 5-minute walk. Strip clubs, gay bars, record shops, and private clubs coexisted without apology. It was messy, loud, and alive. Police raids were frequent, but so were fashion scouts and rising stars. Behind every doorway, there was either trouble or brilliance, or both. The streets echoed with heels, laughter, and the occasional fight. By day, Soho looked like a hangover, but by night, it was electric. It wasn't clean, it wasn't safe, but it was unforgettable. For many, it was the only place they felt truly seen. Brixton was more than a postcode. It was a protest, a rhythm, and a heartbeat. In the 80s, it became a symbol of struggle and resilience. The 1981 riots, sparked by tension and police violence, changed everything. The streets didn't just burn, they screamed. But beyond the headlines, Brixton was a home. Markets pulsed with Caribbean spices and reggae beats. Murals told stories of resistance and pride. People gathered not just in anger, but in celebration, in community, in survival. There was hardship, yes, but also joy in defiance. You didn't pass through Brixton, you felt it. It was raw, proud, and louder than ever, and London would never be the same. Once a quiet neighbourhood of migrants and artists, Notting Hill exploded with life every August. The carnival in the 80s was bold, beautiful, and unfiltered. Steel drums echoed through the streets, sound systems shook the pavements, and dancers in feathers and sequins moved like the city owed them joy. It wasn't just a party, it was a reclaiming of space, culture, and dignity. In a time when racism and tension ran high, Carnival was resistance disguised as celebration. There were clashes with police, but also moments of pure unity. Old people danced with teenagers, strangers hugged. The colours, the bass, the food, it stayed in your clothes, your ears, your memory. You didn't just watch Carnival, you lived it. And if you were lucky, it lived in you forever. On the edge of the Thames stood a complex of brutalist concrete, and behind its grey walls pulsed the soul of 80s culture. The South Bank Centre was where London went to think, listen, and experiment. Poetry readings, underground theatre, student protests. This was art for the people. Some saw it as ugly, others as genius, but no one ignored it. Inside, creative minds challenged everything. Government, gender, class, form. The Royal Festival Hall echoed with orchestras one night and punk bands the next. Outside, skateboarders practiced under pillars, while kids fed pigeons and tourists snapped photos. It was part museum, part playground, part soapbox. South Bank in the 80s didn't demand attention. It earned it. The Barbican Centre in the 1980s looked like something from another planet. All sharp lines, concrete walkways, and hidden entrances. It was either hated or admired, but never ignored. It felt like a fortress built for artists, thinkers, and anyone who didn't fit into the mould. Inside, it was a world of performance, film, and experimentation. School trips wandered into gallery spaces, and music students mingled. Tower Bridge was never just a postcard. In the 80s, the area around it was still industrial, part historic landmark, part forgotten dockland. Tourists posed for photos, but just beyond the frame stood warehouses, cranes, and grit. The river smelled of rust and fuel. Workers in high-vis jackets moved between old buildings that hadn't yet become coffee shops or flats. It wasn't polished, it was raw, stubborn, and still working class. You could walk a few streets and feel like you'd gone back 20 years. Then came whispers of transformation, signs of change in the distance. But in the 80s, Tower Bridge stood as a lonely guardian, surrounded by a city not yet fully reborn. Long before the towers rose, Canary Wharf was a ghost of empire. Old docks, empty warehouses, and silence. It was hard to imagine the financial capital it would become. In the 80s, this space felt lost in time, waiting for something massive to happen. Construction fences began to appear. Hushed conversations about redevelopment floated through council meetings and business papers. But on the ground, it was still decay. You could walk for blocks and hear only your own footsteps. The skyline was empty. The potential was silent. And yet, the foundations were being poured, literally and metaphorically. Canary Wharf in the 80s wasn't impressive, but it was about to change everything. Elephant and Castle was loud, confusing, and impossible to forget. The roundabout was a whirl of buses, honking cars, and endless construction. The pink shopping centre stood like a stubborn relic, loved by some, mocked by others. It was a meeting point for every kind of Londoner, immigrants, students, workers, artists, all packed into tower blocks and narrow streets. The smell of fried food lingered in the air, and discount shops advertised deals that seemed too good to be real. It wasn't pretty, but it was real life. Elephant and Castle was chaotic but human. It didn't try to impress you, it dared you to understand it. Do you still miss the pink centre? Covent Garden in the 80s had just begun its transformation from fading fruit market to buzzing cultural hub. Street performers juggled, mimed, and played violins for spare change, while the old cobblestones echoed with claps and camera clicks. It was still rough around the edges, but that made it exciting. Independent shops opened beside dusty corners of history. The Royal Opera House stood just steps away from punk buskers, and the smell of roasted peanuts mixed with cafe espresso. Tourists wandered in, but locals still claimed the space. It wasn't yet polished into perfection. You could feel the shift happening in real time. Covent Garden wasn't quite what it used to be, and not yet what it would become. But in that in-between space, it was something special, messy, musical, and magnetic. Just a short walk from chaos, St. James's Park offered a breath of calm. Swan boats glided over still water, and office workers ate lunch under trees as Big Ben chimed in the distance. The 80s felt far away inside the park, but that was the magic. Trafalgar Square, on the other hand, was louder. Pigeons ruled the plaza, landing on arms, heads and statues. Protests, music and spontaneous speeches unfolded at the base of Nelson's column. Tourists came for photos, but locals came to speak, to shout, to feel heard. Together, the park and the square showed both sides of the city, its serenity and its spirit. In the 80s, that contrast was everywhere. Step into a tube station in the 80s and time stood still. Many signs hadn't changed since the 40s. Roundels faded, tiles cracked, fonts perfectly imperfect. The air smelled of dust and old metal, and the escalators groaned with every shift. Stations like Baker Street or Aldwych felt frozen in a different London, one of trench coats, paper tickets and echoing announcements. The graffiti crept in, but so did character. It wasn't clean or modern, but it was real. The kind of grime you earned, not avoided. Even with delays, strikes and breakdowns, the tube kept moving. And for anyone growing up then, those signs are still burned into memory. Part map, part museum. London in the 1980s was raw, fast and unforgettable. It wasn't trying to be perfect, it was busy surviving. Between boom and bust, protest and party, grime and glamour, this city revealed its truest self. Every corner told a story, some loud, some quiet, all real. You might remember the smell of Camden on a Saturday, the noise at Brixton Station, or the feel of tube tiles beneath your fingers, because even in its chaos, London gave us something permanent: identity. Which part of 80s London lives in you? If this journey stirred a memory, a face, a feeling, subscribe now to revisit more places time tried to change, but never truly erased.